Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Café with your host, Brian Mallow.
Good evening, everybody. Hello. Well, yeah, sure. That's a great way to start off a show. Welcome to the Daily Planet Cafe here in the Nature Research Center at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And it's Thursday night, so it's Science Thursday, and it's our Science Cafe. Thanks for being here. Is anyone here for the first time? Welcome. Our guest is here for the first time. And welcome. Yeah. You're laughing a lot already. Good. It's better than frowning, I guess. Well, welcome. We have a fantastic program, and for those of you that are new here, we do this every Thursday. Next week, the first Thursday of each month, we have Science Trivia Night, and people compete in teams. It's a lot of fun. And then also something we've just done twice before, and we're going to do for the third time, in the third Thursday, the 4th, the 11th, the 18th, February 18th, we have another Science Spelling Bee. So I think there's still some slots if you email Katie Alman, and you can register as a team. And it's been a lot of fun. We've done it twice, and we're going to do it again. But most of our Thursday nights are a Science Cafe. So the format will be a relatively short presentation, maybe 20 minutes or so. And the rest of our hour will be question and answer. Your questions, his answers, for the most part. So we encourage you to ask questions. I'll bring a mic around, so when it comes to that time, I'll try to get to you in the order you raise your hands. Just be looking for me, and I'll be bringing the mic around because we like to get everything on mic, because our programs are streamed live on YouTube, and they'll be archived there later. So without any further ado, you ready for our program? Very nice crowd. I think a lot of anticipation for this. It's a really interesting subject about a fascinating human fossil find from 2013, which is actually very new, and the information was only publicized this last year, about this incredible find, first made by some cavers in kind of a deep, not very accessible cave, and it turned out to be a very rich find. And our guest is a professor of evolutionary anthropology, human fossil record, and especially an interest in weaponry and early technologies. So he's from Duke University, if I didn't say that. How about a nice round of applause for our guest, Stephen Churchill.
Thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction. I'm not very used to using a mic, so but Brian assures me that he will gesture if I get it too far away from my mouth. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. This is a great crowd. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in South Africa. We have been, for about 20 years, I've been working in an area outside of Johannesburg. It's a World Heritage Site called the Cradle of Humankind, and there are a number of caves there which have produced human fossils of human ancestors. You can see on the map, so the small inset, the star shows you where the Cradle of Humankind is within South Africa. It's just outside of Johannesburg. It takes about an hour to get there if the traffic's okay. And the larger map, each of the skulls represents a cave site in the Cradle of Humankind which has produced human fossils. So it's a very, very rich area. And one of the great things about this area is we have, it sounds like this mic is cutting in and out on me. Is it? I'm good? I'm okay? Maybe it's just my not being very used to talking on a mic. So anyway, what's great about the Cradle of Humankind is that we have got deposits there which span the time period from about 2.5 million to very recent time. So we have got a very, very long and good record, deep time record of human evolution in the cradle. And one of the things that we're trying to sort out there is the transition from members of the genus Australopithecus to members of our own genus, the genus Homo. I hate to use the term ape man. I hate the term ape man because it sounds very, very Victorian to me. But prior to about 2 million years ago, the fossil record of Africa is populated by what can only be described as ape men. If you saw them, you would basically say, okay, these things are the size of apes, they've got brains the size of apes, their ecology and behavior is very ape-like, their diet is ape-like. The only thing that you would notice that was weird about them was that they habitually walked on 2 legs. So prior to about 2 million years ago, that's really all we've got in the human fossil record. After about 1.8 million, we've got Homo erectus. The human. A larger body size, a body build like ours, longer legs, a bigger brain. And this is, I cannot overstate the importance of this transition in human evolution because everything changes at this boundary. By the time that we've got Homo erectus, we are seeing an ecological shift, expanded tool use. These guys are making and using stone tools. They're eating a lot more animal tissues, meat, fat, brain tissue, stuff like that. Their brains get larger. They seem to be using their brains in new ways. Their life history slows down. They start growing slower. They have a longer childhood. There's evidence for a change in social structure. We begin to see changes in their skeleton reflecting greater efficiency at walking, longer distances. They range farther, and suddenly, as soon as they make the scene in Africa, we start picking them up in other places as well. We find them right about the same time, 1.8 million years ago, in the Republic of Georgia in Western Asia. And very quickly after that, they spread along the southern coast of Asia into Indonesia and mainland Asia. So this is a huge transition, and one that we're sort of trying to get a better and better resolution on, because unfortunately, at that critical time window, around 2 million to 1.8 million years ago, the fossil record in Africa is just very, very poor. And what we do pick up, a lot of very diverse fossils, which seem to represent possibly several different species or one very, very variable species. So, we have been doing a systematic survey of cave sites in the cradle of humankind. In this part of the world, if you want to find fossils, you've got to find caves because of the way that fossils preserve there. So we've been doing that in a couple of different ways, but one of the ways that we've been trying to really systematically explore all of the caves is we reached out to members of the local caving community. And these 3 guys here, the guy that you see with the bandana on his head in the lower right-hand corner, his name is Pedro Boshoff, and he's worked with us for about 20 years. He was a graduate student at the University of the Witwatersrand. He's collected fossils with us for a long time, but he is a local caver. So he's a part of the caving community. So we went to Pedro and we said, look, would you just start talking to cavers and educating them about the fossils in the caves and get them to basically be on the lookout for us, you know, get them to be the eyes and ears for us. So Pedro did do that. He started talking to cavers. And in mid-September of 2013, these other 2 guys, that's a guy named Steve Tucker on the top, and in the lower left-hand corner, that's Rick Hunter. And Steve and Rick were exploring a cave outside of Joburg in the cradle called Rising Star. And the cave is very well known to local cavers. It gets a lot of traffic from local cavers. And so they had just gone in for, you know, a quick trip to, and they were at the top of a feature called the Dragon's Back in Rising Star. And Rick wanted to take a picture of something, so, and Steve was like in the frame of the shot, and he was like, you know, get out of the way. So Steve saw that there was a little fissure extending off to his right, and he squeezed himself into the fissure to get out of the picture that Rick was trying to take. And he realized that the fissure continued vertically below him. So he began squeezing himself down into the fissure, and then he said those magic words to Rick, which every caver loves to hear: "It goes," meaning the fissure keeps going. It turns out that that fissure was 36 feet, vertical feet, a 36-foot drop, but very narrow. In places, it only got down to about 7 inches, about so wide. So Steve continued wriggling his way down this fissure, and Rick followed him. And Steve eventually got to a point where there was nothing below his legs anymore. His legs were just dangling. And, you know, if it were me, that's when I would start going back up, because who knows, it could be 100 feet drop below you, right? 100-foot drop. He was braver than I am, and he kicked his feet around and sort of found a foothold and lowered himself down into the chamber. And then Rick came along as well, and they found themselves in a basically unknown, you know, on no previous trip had they ever heard about or gone in this chamber. But they did see that there was evidence that one caver had been in there before. There were some footprints and there was a surveying pin. And we have in fact found that caver. He'd been in about 10 years earlier into the chamber. But they started looking around this little chamber at the bottom of this very, very deep and tight fissure, and they noticed fossils on the surface of the chamber. So they took photographs of what they were seeing. They went and notified Pedro, and along with Pedro, they went to see my colleague Lee Berger in Johannesburg, and they showed Lee the pictures. This is one of the pictures. In South Africa, it's illegal to collect any fossils without a permit, so they knew that they were not to pick anything up, to take anything out of the cave. So all we got from that initial trip were photographs, but here they had moved one of the fossils, which was loose on the surface, onto some sort of plastic map holder or something they had, put it with a little tape measure. And we got very excited because we recognized this is clearly a human fossil. This is a hominid material. So we were quite excited. Lee visited the cave that week. He took his teenage son, Matthew. Matthew's also a very skinny, gangly guy, and he got Matthew to take photographs for us. And based on what we were seeing in the photographs, we thought that we had a partial or associated skeleton of a single early hominin individual. We could see in the sediments a partial cranium. That's the lower jaw. We could also see some of the bones of the postcranial skeleton, some of the limb bones on the surface. So we thought we had a single skeleton down there. We thought, based on what we could see in this picture, that we were looking at something that we already knew in the fossil record of South Africa. We didn't think it was something new. But we were very, very excited to have an associated skeleton where we had a lot of parts that we know belong to the same individual. So we went to National Geographic. We got emergency funding for a 3-week expedition to go into the chamber and remove the skeleton. Now, part of the problem is that this deep 7 and trying to excavate something like that. So the first question before us was like, how are we going to get these things out of there? And we decided to kind of crowdsource the problem. There is a paleoanthropology Facebook page where all of our colleagues get on there and we, you know, complain about things to each other. And we posted a notice on Facebook and we said, look, we're looking for people who have excavation experience, who hopefully have either a master's or PhD in paleontology, paleoanthropology, geology, archaeology, some sort of related discipline, who have caving and or rock climbing experience, who have emergency medical training, because we knew if something happened in that chamber, it would be very, very difficult to extract somebody. And they had to be small enough to get down there. And working in very, very claustrophobic, humid, uncomfortable conditions. So we broadcast this on the Paleoanthropology Facebook page. We got about, I think, 70 applications from around the world, most of them graduate students or recent PhDs in the field. We parsed the list. We got it down to a list of about 10 individuals. We started doing Skype interviews with them, and we eventually narrowed it down to these 6 individuals. Hello. There we go. These 6 young ladies, and their lives changed very, very rapidly. 1 week they were talking to us on Skype, and a week later they were flying to South Africa for a 3-week expedition. So the bones were first brought to our attention on October 1st of 2013, and we started the expedition the first week of November. So we got everything into place in about 4 weeks. Now, as I said, the conditions were very, very difficult. Besides having to negotiate the fissure, you've got to get to the top of the dragon's back to even get there. And these ladies worked in very, very difficult conditions. They worked in very, very dangerous conditions. There were a few scares and mishaps, but they did it. This is a picture from one of the National Geographic photographers who could also get down into the chamber from above, just to show you sort of what the working conditions were like. They went down in teams of 3. So we had six excavators. They went in teams of 3. They would work for 2 hours, and then so we got an 8-hour excavation each day. A little bit. One would sit in the fissure above the chamber, recording things on. But we really had to change the way that we did the business of excavating. Here's another picture from the surface, just to give you an idea of what the conditions were. And the process of finding and working the site. So whenever our excavators, on any given day, we probably had about weeks, and on any given day, helped with the technical. They monitored our CO2 build. They also, along the route from the, that whenever anybody was moving in the system, we could keep track of who was where and what was happening. How we were going to maintain provenience. The act of collecting fossils is destructive, because destructive in the sense that we are removing that fossil from its geological context, the way that it was. So we have called a theodolite, and we just shoot an infrared beam
anything that might have.
So this site's not very promising. We have a guy who does a lot of ancient DNA work from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, Svante Pabo. And the problem is the cave is too wet and a little bit too warm, and the DNA is degraded in her work.
All right, so let's start right over here.
They are sort of what
I guess 2 million years ago in 1.8 million precipitated the change from the Homo.
There is a 2.5 million years ago, which is sort of when we consider the ice ages to have started, and the glacial cycles began. And so grasslands are expanding in Africa from 2.5 million on. And if you're a terrestrial primate like us, there's probably a lot of competition on the ground because terrestrial monkeys started to become more diverse. There were many different species of baboons and baboon relatives. There were even terrestrial colobus monkeys. The diversity in the human fossil record after they got deposited. We extracted 1,550 fossils, hominin fossils. There's thousands more down there. We only had 3 weeks. I mean, we thought we were taking a single skeleton out. We thought we could do it in 3 weeks. And we don't really know how we're going to continue to work in the cave because it's logistically so difficult. It requires so much support to have our excavators down there. We've done a little bit more excavation since then, but not much. So we fully expect, and there may be more than 15 individuals completely represented. Now the problem got mixed up, so we can't be sure. We do have a hand skeleton, which was found in anatomical articulation, and a foot skeleton. So those had clearly walked, soft tissue holding them together. And we're hoping as we get deeper that we'll find more and more individuals who are partially connected. But right now we don't really know. And when I showed you that picture of the skeleton laid out and with all the bones around, that's a composite. We don't know that that's a single individual. We've just put bones together.
Steve, that hand and that foot that you just said were articulated, meaning they were still together like that. Were they in themselves diagnostically different? Like they're clearly a different species. Like you could look at that somewhat complete hand or foot and know it's not a known species?
Well, yeah, it's not quite that easy. The foot is actually remarkably modern. This creature is a strange creature. And if you were to pick up bones from the knee down, you would say, okay, this could be the remains of a little hunter-gatherer from southern Africa or something like that. If you really, really study the anatomy, you begin to see some subtle differences, but the foot is actually very, very modern. The hand is very modern in some respects and very primitive in other respects. The fingers are very curved. The finger bones themselves are very, very curved. We know that's
Is that a modern or primitive trait?
That's primitive. So ours are straight. You see curved fingers in chimpanzees and orangutans, and we know that that curvature only develops if babies are climbing and they're consistently climbing. In zoo animals that don't do a lot of climbing, their finger bones develop straight. Their phalanges are straight. So we know, seeing that curvature, we know these guys are still doing a lot of climbing. They're still partially dependent on the trees. That's a very primitive trait. So they're a strange mosaic of very primitive features and very modern features.
And all the bones you found are potentially this one species, this one new species?
Yeah, well, as we were getting the papers through review, some of the reviewers thought, well, how do you know that it all belongs to one species? And in fact, almost all of the other caves in the cradle of humankind have produced at least 2 species of hominid. So our answer to that is that we have multiple parts represented or the same anatomical part represented in multiple individuals. So for instance, the top of the thigh bone, we've got about 8 adult examples of the top of the thigh bone. The anatomy is sort of very unique. It looks a lot like an Australopith, but it's a little bit different. But every one of them's the same. We have, 7, first premolars. They're all the same. So every case in which we've got duplicated elements, they're all anatomically the same. And so our response to the reviewers is, it would be highly improbable that we would find, every thigh bone we found belonged to an Australopith, and every tooth we found belonged to the genus Homo. So we're quite confident it's all one thing.
Your situation brings up a methodological question. You're treating this as essentially a burial. Sediments?
Yeah, so all of the sediments come out as well. So the fossils are packaged separately, and all the sediments come out, and all the sediments are being wet screened through, they go meshes, and they're wet screened, and then at random, every 5th sample or something like that goes through what's called flotation, where we put a surfactant in there and we foam it up with water, and that causes organic things, like if there's seeds or bits of wood or something like that, it causes them to float to the surface, and they're scraped off the top. So we are looking at the sediments as well. And as I said, what's really interesting about the sediments is they have a very, very characteristic chemical signal of minerals that you find in mammal bodies, which you don't normally find in the bottom of a cave. Cool.
The bone/fossils, do you guys know if they're younger or older than the famous skeleton Lucy?
Yeah, so I can tell you almost for sure they're younger than Lucy, because we know that Lucy is 3.2 million years old, and we don't think any of these caves opened up here until 2.5 million years ago. Is that what you meant? Did you mean like geological age? Yeah. Yeah, they're younger than Lucy, more recent than Lucy.
You said that there was only one possibility for how they got into the cave. You said that they were probably thrown in by their own kind. How do you eliminate the possibility of a flood or something like that, them being washed into the cave?
Right.
Because there was evidence of water.
So that's a great question. And that was our first thought, that this is a group which died in some sort of natural catastrophe. They went into the cave because there was a brush fire, and they're trying to escape that, and maybe they died from carbon dioxide in the cave. Or there were heavy rains, and they were taking shelter in the cave, and the cave flooded, and they drowned. There are a couple of things that tell us that in the chamber next to the chamber that they're in, we have stuff that's washed in from the outside. But in that chamber, there's nothing that's washed in from the outside. There are no rocks from the surface. But we have very, very few young adults. And if you look at troops of primates, whether they're baboons or chimpanzees or human hunters and gatherers, you get the reverse. You get some kids, mostly young adults, and some older people. So we have actually the reverse profile. And this profile is what we call a cemetery sample. If you look at the people who die in primate groups or in hunters and gatherers, it's mostly kids and older individuals. So if it were a social group that had died in there and got washed in, we would expect to see a lot of young adults and few kids and few older people. And we see the reverse. So again, we just can't rule out that idea that they're dropping them in themselves.
Thanks for the presentation. Burials sometimes, well, how to say this? Most burials are not just burying the individual. There's also artifacts, tools, or clothing. Have you found evidence of, or perhaps this speaks? Secondly, you mentioned the use of uranium for dating.
Yeah.
Could you describe the difference between uranium and carbon-12?
Yeah. So the first question, we've been careful not to try not to use the term burial. Instead, we refer to this as disposal of the dead, purposeful disposal of the dead. We haven't found any artifacts in there. We would expect by 2.5 million years ago. So, part of what our colleagues have reacted to is when they hear of purposeful disposal of the dead, they imagine a whole package of behaviors that has to do with some sort of thinking about an afterlife, ritualistic behavior, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're basically saying this is probably something as simple as these little critters recognize that when a member of their social group dies, if they leave them on the surface, pretty soon hyenas are going to be pulling them apart, and lions are going to be working the carcass over, and that's distressing. Trying to tuck them out of the way in a place where nothing can get to them. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. And a lot of our colleagues have come forward and said, look, chimpanzees and gorillas and other primates and even non-primate mammals show what appear to be mourning behaviors, and they show behavior towards dead bodies, which is at least that complex. Now, with respect to the uranium series, so carbon-14 works on a radioactive isotope of carbon that's in the atmosphere and gets bound up in our bodies as we breathe and we eat plants that have bound it up from the atmosphere. And once we die, we quit taking it in, and it starts decaying to 14. So we can look at the ratio of the more common type of carbon to carbon-14. But the problem is, after about 50,000 years, there's not enough of the radio. Uranium. And it decays into a series of daughter isotopes, and it eventually becomes lead-238. Goes from uranium-238 to lead-238. But all of the daughter isotopes are water-soluble, and the formations are made in water. So it's one of the daughter isotopes and only the radioactive particle. So by looking at the ratios of the different daughter isotopes to the amount of uranium in there, we can get accurate dates. But in this case, what happened was that when those flowstones started to form, the water that was working through the chamber during heavy storms was washing mud from the actual sediments into the flowstone, and that the dirt was getting incorporated into the flowstones. And the dirt has got its own daughter isotopes from the uranium, so it was contaminating. It's what we call dirty flowstones. So we're hoping we can find clean segments of the flowstone in there, and those will give us spot-on dates, really, really good dates. But we just haven't gotten there yet.
Did you check for markings or artwork in the region that had the dragon's back, or is that something you've not had a chance to?
We haven't systematically looked, but there has been, at this point, tens of thousands of people hours spent in that cave, and also a lot of bored cavers who are sitting at their station, sort of, waiting, to do whatever it is that they need to do. And we haven't seen anything like that. We haven't systematically looked.
So I was wondering what the lifespan you think is of this species, and I can understand how you tell the difference between an infant and a but how do you tell from a middle-aged person to, say, a slightly older?
Yeah, that's two great questions. We don't really yet know the lifespan. It's unlikely that most of these individuals were living past their mid-40s. That's probably the upper end. But we largely go on dental wear because the teeth wear throughout the lifetime. And what we can do is we can compare the wear on the different teeth. We know, our cheek teeth, the molars, in modern humans, the first one comes in at age 6 on average. The second one comes in at age 12, and the third comes in at age 18. So there's a 6-year interval between each one. So we can take an individual and we can compare the amount of wear on the second to the first. We know that difference is 6 years of wear. And then between the third and the first, we know that's 12 years of wear. And we can actually get very, very good sort of relative scales. And that
So, if the animal was dumping its dead into the cave, would it have been exploring the cave or in the cave at other times, or would it have gone that far into the cave to put the bodies in there?
I have no idea. I wish I knew. But yeah, so clearly dead bodies are finding their way into the cave somehow. But what else they might have been doing, we don't know. We don't have any evidence at this time that early humans were living in these caves. And probably for these little guys, caves were not safe places because there were leopards denning in the caves or hyenas or whatever. And so probably they probably tended to avoid the caves, but we don't really know what their overall use was.
I was wondering who funded this project and what your future plans are for the site. Who would fund that?
Yeah, also great questions. So we have enjoyed very good support from National Geographic. We have also enjoyed good financial support from the government of South Africa, and we have outstanding particularly a woman named Lyda Hill from Texas has been very, very generous. And so we've been able to basically do everything that we need to do with that funding. We're going to continue to work in the cave because we need to get the rest of the fossils out of there. And we have other sites that are also producing fossils. So we're fighting battles on multiple fronts, and it's logistically complex. But one thing that I'm really proud of, all I've talked about so far tonight is the science, and the recovery, the expedition. But the thing that I'm actually more excited about than the science is that we're using this site and we're using these fossils to try to change the way that business is done in our field. Because paleoanthropology has historically been a field full of cronyism. People find fossils, they limit access, only their friends can see the fossils. They sit on stuff for 20 years before they publish it. And the day we announced these fossils, we put 3D surface scans, detailed 3D surface scans of 90 of the specimens on a Duke-hosted site called Morphosource. And our colleagues were printing 3D casts of the material the day we announced and taking it to their classes. But what we did with the analysis was we invited applications from early career stage scientists. And we defined early career stage as anyone who is not quite defended their PhD up to not quite gotten tenure at a university. And we brought 40 of them on our dime for a month in Johannesburg. They all worked on different aspects of the skeleton because we had a practical problem. We had 1,500 bones that needed to be analyzed. And those early career stage scientists, all of them, if you look at the announcement that came out in September, there are 47 of us on there. So they are all authors on that, and they're all authoring papers on different parts of the anatomy. And so we have an enormous collaborative team approach that we will continue to use. And those 6 ladies who excavated the fossils, 4 of them are on our scientific team and are publishing with us. 2 of them are pursuing graduate studies in archaeology here in North America, but 4 of them are continuing to work with us.
Well, Steve, this has been excellent. We have just a few minutes left, and I think when we wrap up the program, you may find that there are more questions, so you may not quite be done yet. But I just thought it might be interesting since generals, besides this specific find, you have this interest in human fossils and weaponry and tool use and technologies. So we don't have much time, but I just thought, what is it like? What sorts of questions are the questions within that realm in general? What are the questions you're trying to answer about humanity?
Okay, now you have unleashed the beast. Now we're going to have to be here for a couple hours.
You have 2 sentences. No, you can maybe not hours.
There are a couple things, actually. One thing that is really interesting to me is that there's evolutionary feedback loops between technology and the evolution of our. Really, really interesting that the technology helps us do things, but it also creates selection pressure, which shapes our anatomy. And that coevolution of technology and human anatomy is fascinating to me. And then the second thing is most of what I work on is subsistence technology, early hunting tools. And it's really interesting to me to sort of try to understand how the world looked, how the edible world looked to people who had relatively primitive tools.
Yeah. And then just one final question that maybe not your research questions, but what if I just ask you what's the one question you most want the answer to?
Yeah, I'm not,
is there one? Yeah, that's a...
Yeah.
All right.
I want all the answers.
All right. Yeah. All right. Well, like I said, we're going to have more questions for you, I suspect, because there were some hands that I couldn't get to right there at the end. But once again, for Steve Churchill from Duke. And thanks for all your great questions. Next week is science trivia, and in a few weeks we have another spelling bee. Thank you very much. This building is still open till 9. So thanks, and we'll see you next time. Good night.